Hello and welcome back to my channel. So today I'd like to show you a portrait that most people have probably never seen before. Because when we think of Charlotte Brontë, it's usually the Branwell family pillar portrait that comes to mind, or perhaps George Richmond's famous portrait from 1850. Those are the images that have been shaped by how we picture Charlotte today. But this one is different. It's usually described as a portrait of Charlotte Brontë by the Victorian artist Abraham Solomon, painted around about 1850. And I'll be honest with you, when I first came across it, I simply accepted that description. I mean, after all, why wouldn't I? But then I started asking what I thought would be some fairly straightforward questions. When did Charlotte sit for Abraham Solomon? Where did they meet? And what did Charlotte think of that finished portrait? Did she like it? Did she hate it? Did any of her friends comment on it? Did Mrs. Gaskell mention it in her biography? Surely those answers would have been easy enough to find. Well, I've made myself a cup of tea, I've opened a few books and I started searching through letters and biographies. And before long, I disappeared down one of those very big Brontë rabbit holes that I'm sure many of you know only too well about. And the more I searched, the stranger the story became. Because I couldn't find Charlotte talking about Abraham Solomon. I couldn't find Abraham Solomon talking about Charlotte. I couldn't find any record of Charlotte actually sitting for him. And then another question occurred to me. If this really is a portrait of Charlotte Brontë, why don't we ever see it? Why isn't it one of those portraits that's reproduced in books or displayed in museums or instantly recognised by us Brontë enthusiasts? But instead of answering just one question, every answer seemed to then create two more questions. Now, before we go any further, I should really say something quite important. This video isn't about trying to rewrite history or prove that everyone has got it wrong. It's about following the evidence that survives, asking sensible questions and seeing where those questions actually lead us. Because sometimes history gives us wonderfully clear answers, and sometimes it simply leaves us with mysteries. So today, that's exactly what we are going to do. We're going to investigate this portrait together. Who was Abraham Solomon? Did he and Charlotte actually ever meet? And if she never sat for him, how could he have painted this portrait? Did Charlotte ever know this portrait even existed? And perhaps the biggest question of all, is this really a portrait of Charlotte Brontë as she appeared in 1850, or is there far more to the story than most of us realise? So, right, my tea is over here, it's nice and warm, I've got my notes, I think we better start at the beginning. So, let's find out how deep this particular Brontë rabbit hole goes. Right, a few things to point out. Yes, I'm in my new house. It's a beautifully sunny day. At the moment, I'm not too hot in the sun, but if it comes around, we might move. Now, before we carry on, there is an elephant in the room, and I'm sure you've all spotted it. The comedy lampshade. Yes, it is teeny tiny, and yes, it is too small for that lamp. But I'm kind of limited at the moment with what I've got and what I haven't got. I'm still very much sourcing furniture, bits and bobs. And one of the things I'm desperate for is a better size lampshade. I bought this in a charity shop for 50p and thought I'd be fine and got it home. And now I'm thinking, yeah, okay, it does look rather silly. So ignore the comedy lampshade. Before we start trying to answer any of those questions, let's spend a few minutes just looking at the portrait itself. The painting is usually identified as a portrait of Charlotte Brontë by Victorian artist, like we said, Abraham Solomon, and is generally dated to around about 1850. At first glance, there's nothing particularly unusual about that. Charlotte was becoming increasingly well known after the success of Jane Eyre, and Abraham Solomon was very established as a portrait painter. And on the face of it, the story seemed perfectly plausible. But history has taught me that it's always worth looking beyond the label. And as many of you know, I love finding out not just what happened, but how we know it happened. Where does this evidence come from? Who recorded it? And can we trace it back to someone who was actually there? I mean, those questions are just as important as the story itself. So, before I've even opened Charlotte's letters or Mrs. Gaskell's biography, I spent some time simply studying the painting. What do we actually see? Well, we have Charlotte seated beside this table with scattered papers. Her right elbow is resting on the tabletop while her head leans gently against her right hand in this thoughtful pose. In her left hand, she's holding a quill, as though she's paused in the middle of writing. She wears what appears to be this very soft pink dress with a white blouse underneath, finished with this delicate lace collar fastened by a brooch at the neck. Over the top is a black lace shawl, or cardigan as I keep calling it, and the lace cuffs at her wrist matches the collar beautifully. Around her neck is this very long chain where it's tucked into the front of the dress. And on her left wrist she wears a bracelet with what looks like a small charm hanging from it. Her hair is parted in the middle, but rather than being arranged in that neat style we often associate with Charlotte, it's gathered more loosely around her head, and of course it's decorated with small flowers. It's an attractive portrait, and at first glance it's easy to understand why someone would accept this as a likeness for Charlotte Brontë. But the more I looked at it, the more I began to notice the little details. The quill in her left hand, loose papers everywhere, the thoughtful pose, flowers in her hair. They're all gentle reminders that we're not just looking at a woman, we're looking at an artist's interpretation of a writer. Everything in that painting seems carefully chosen to reinforce Charlotte's identity as an author. Then, of course, there's Charlotte herself. She has that high forehead that we recognise from other likenesses. And there are certain similarities in the shape of her face and, of course, her expression. But there are differences too. Is that simply artistic licence? Was the artist trying to flatter his sitter, as most Victorian portrait painters did? Or could there be another explanation altogether? At this stage, we simply don't know, and that's why I think it's important not to jump to any conclusions based on the appearance alone. After all, portraits aren't photographs, they're an artist's interpretation, and sometimes they tell us just as much about the artist as they do about the person sitting in front of them. Or perhaps, as we'll discover, the person sitting in front of them wasn't there at all. Now that's quite a thought, isn't it? So rather than trying to decide whether this looks like Charlotte Brontë, let's do something that good researchers should do. Let's put the painting to one side for a moment and start looking at the evidence. Can we actually place Charlotte Brontë and Abraham Solomon in the same place at the same time? Because if we can't, then this mystery becomes a whole lot more interesting. To work out whether Charlotte ever sat for Abraham Solomon, I think we first need to look at one of the portraits that we know she definitely did sit for. And fortunately, there's no mystery about this one. So, in June 1850, Charlotte travelled to London to stay with her publisher and friend George Smith. By this time, Jane Eyre had made her one of the most talked about novelists in Britain, although as we know, she really didn't like being in the public attention. George Smith thought it would be a wonderful idea to have her portrait drawn, both as a gift for her father, Patrick Brontë, and as this lasting record of the author whose books were proving so successful at that time. The artist chosen for the job was George Richmond. Now, Unlike Abraham Solomon, we can place George Richmond and Charlotte Brontë together with complete confidence. Not because somebody repeated the story years later, but because the evidence is still there. George Smith wrote about arranging the sitting in his memoirs. Charlotte wrote about the portrait in her letters, and Patrick Brontë thanked George Smith for sending it to him in Haworth. Even Mrs. Gaskell discusses it in her book, The Life of Charlotte Brontë. This isn't family legend or Victorian gossip, it's documented history. Charlotte sat for George Richmond during her visit to London in June 1850, and several sittings were needed before the portrait was completed. Mind you, Charlotte wasn't entirely comfortable with that whole experience. George Richmond later recalled one rather awkward moment. So Charlotte arrives wearing this small pad beneath her hair and her hat, give this extra height, something that wasn't unusual at the time. But Richmond politely asked if she would mind removing it before he began drawing. Poor Charlotte was so embarrassed that she burst into tears. I mean, I always feel really sorry for her when I read that story. I mean, she had a real thing about her height, didn't she? She'd already disliked being the centre of attention and sitting for a portrait. It must have been so uncomfortable. I mean, without being asked to sort of change your whole appearance at the last minute. When the portrait was finished, Charlotte had a very emotional reaction. George Smith remembered that when she finally did see the painting, she burst into tears because it reminded her so strongly of one of her sisters. He believed it was Anne, although later the biographer Winifred Guerin suggested it was Emily. Either way, the likeliness clearly touched a very raw nerve. Patrick Brontë, however, was delighted and in a letter thanked George Smith. He praised Richmond's work, saying the artist had produced a correct likeness and had captured not only Charlotte's appearance, but something of her character as well. I mean, that's really quite an endorsement, isn't it? I mean, from someone who's obviously looked at Charlotte's face every day for more than, 30 years? Not everyone agreed, though. Mrs. Gaskell later admitted there were mixed opinions about the portrait, observing that people who knew Charlotte best were often the least satisfied with the resemblance. Ellen Nussey also felt Richmond had softened Charlotte's features and made her rather prettier than she really was. Gosh, she was brave. I mean, in other words, even the portrait we know Charlotte did sit for wasn't universally accepted as a perfect likeness. A perfect likeness. And I think that's worth remembering. Portraits are, like we said, interpretations as much as records. No artist paints exactly what a camera would capture. But here's the really important point. We have letters, we have memoirs, we have eyewitnesses, we have Patrick Bronte's response, and we have Mrs. Gaskell discussing it. There is this very unbroken trail of evidence showing exactly how George Richmond's painting came into existence. Now, keep that thought in mind, because when we turn to Abraham Solomon, that trail almost disappears completely. Before we start looking for a connection between Abraham Solomon and Charlotte Brontë, I think it's only fair that we spend a few minutes getting to know the artist himself, because although his name isn't sort of particularly familiar today, during the middle of the 19th century, he was a respected and successful painter with an impressive reputation. Abraham Solomon was born in London in 1824 into a remarkable family of artists. His brother Simone Solomon became well known for his richly imaginative paintings. Pause for a second. The actual correct pronunciation I've since found out is Simeon. Well, his sister, Rebecca Solomon, also forged a successful career at a time when it was far more difficult for women to be recognised professionally as artists. You could almost say that artistic talents ran throughout that whole family. And as a young man, Abraham studied at the Royal Academy School, and his career developed so quickly. He specialises in what we know as genre paintings. These weren't portraits in that traditional sense, but carefully constructed scenes from everyday Victorian life. They were often telling a story or capturing a moment filled with emotion. If you've ever seen a painting, say, of a nervous bride or an anxious family, or a courtroom drama or touching domestic scenes from the Victorian period, you'll have a good idea of the sort of work that he became famous for. His paintings were popular and they were exhibited regularly at the Royal Academy, and he built a reputation as an artist with a wonderful eye for detail and a talent for capturing expressions and atmosphere. By 1850, when this portrait is thought to have been painted, Abraham Solomon was already establishing himself as one of the most promising young artists of his generation. So, on the face of it, there is nothing at all surprising about the suggestion that he might have painted Charlotte Brontë. In fact, if somebody had simply told me that Charlotte sat for a portrait for Abraham Solomon while she was, say, visiting in London, I probably wouldn't have questioned it for a second, because it really does sound quite believable. But history isn't about believing something because it sounds plausible. It's about asking whether we can actually prove it. So I began looking for the sort of evidence we found so easily for George Richmond. I wanted to discover when Abraham Solomon and Charlotte met, who introduced them, where the sitting actually took place, and whether Charlotte mentioned him in one of her letters, or whether Solomon himself ever recorded painting one, of course, the most famous novelist of that Victorian age. Those don't seem like unreasonable questions. In fact, that's exactly the sort of detail that survives for George Richmond's portrait. So, with a fresh cup of tea, I sat down and I thought it was going to be a very straightforward afternoon of research. I started working through biographies, catalogues, letters, exhibition records and contemporary accounts, fully expecting the pieces of this puzzle to just fall neatly into place. Instead, something rather unexpected happened. The trail didn't become clearer. It almost disappeared completely. So, having learned a little about Abraham Solomon, I did what I always try to do whenever I'm researching a Brontë topic. I went looking for the evidence. By now, we've already seen how easy it is to follow a story because we've looked at George Richmond's portrait. Charlotte wrote about it in her letters. George Smith described arranging the sittings, and of course we have Patrick thanking him for the portrait, as well as good old Mrs. Gaskell including it in her biography. There's so many contemporary references that we can piece together sort of this remarkable, clear timeline of exactly what happened. Naturally, I expected to find something similar for Abraham Solomon. Perhaps a letter saying Charlotte was going to sit for him, or perhaps an entry into Solomon's records. Perhaps George Smith mentioned another portrait, or even Mrs. Gaskell's kind of referred to it when she was describing Charlotte's likeness. After all, it's one of Britain's most celebrated novelists. I mean, if they had sat for a portrait by an artist who regularly exhibits at the Royal Academy, you might reasonably expect somebody to have actually mentioned it. So I started looking. I worked through surviving letters. I revisited Mr. Gaskell's book. I looked at George Smith. Maybe he'd written something about Charlotte's visit in London. And I searched for any contemporary reference that might place Charlotte and Abraham Solomon together. And this is where things become really interesting, because I couldn't find a documented meeting between them. Now, that doesn't mean they never met, because Victorian London wasn't this tiny little village, and not every meeting was ever written down. Historians are always very careful about saying something never happened simply because no record has survived. What we can say, however, is that at the moment, there doesn't appear to be any surviving contemporary evidence that Charlotte Brontë sat for Abraham Solomon. There's no surviving letters from Charlotte mentioning him, and of course Mrs. Gaskell doesn't appear to refer to him on the portrait. That's a very different situation from the wealth of evidence around George Richmond's portrait. And I have to admit, that really did surprise me. I hadn't set out to solve a mystery. I thought I was simply going to learn a little more of an unfamiliar portrait. Instead, the more I searched, the more I realised that the story seemed to consist of a painting and very little explanation of how this painting came to exist. And if you watch my channel for a while, you'll know I'm always asking where the evidence comes from. And this was one of those moments where I felt I needed to dig a little deeper. It doesn't prove the portrait is wrong, and it certainly doesn't prove that Abraham Solomon never painted Charlotte. What it does tell us is that we need to be cautious. We need to separate what we know from what we assume, and we need to follow that evidence wherever it's going to lead us, even if that means admitting that some questions don't yet have clear answers. So, if we can't yet prove that Charlotte sat for Abraham Solomon, perhaps we're asking the wrong question altogether. Maybe we should be asking something rather different. If Charlotte didn't sit for this portrait, where did Abraham Solomon get her likeness from? Okay, I'm starting to get a little hot now. I might have to pull the curtain a bit. Shall we see if this makes a difference? Sorry, I'm just putting my flip-flops on. Where is it coming from? Not that side, it's this side, next to the comedy lampshade. That kind of helps a bit, doesn't it? I'm just going to have tanned legs because I've got my shorts on, but at least I'm cooler on my top. But it's a beautiful day. But the reason I'm not filming outside, making the most of the weather, is extremely windy. And unless you want the camera permanently bouncing around, which would probably make you feel quite travel sick, I decided I would do it inside. Plus, I'm making the most of my new home in my new chair, which was given to me. It's very comfortable. I'm very happy in my new chair. It's very exciting having a new house, isn't it? It's been years since I've moved, so it was all very exciting, unpacking. So I'm still searching for a pair of scissors. I know that sounds bizarre, but I know I packed them. I can almost remember popping them in a box. Have they turned up? No. Do I know where they are? No. I have no idea where they've got to, and I know I did pack them. So the mystery of the scissors continues. Right, I think I need to top up my tea. It's tide's gone out. Fresh drink filled to the top, a bit high. I've got to be really careful I don't slop it down myself. So tell me, everybody, what are you all reading at the moment? Lots of recommendations on your to be read list from the last video. Love it. Thank you. Keep going. Also want to know, what Brontë book are you reading or rereading at the moment? Are you trying out something new? Are you trying a book that's related to the Brontës but not actually one of their novels? Yeah, tell me all about it. I want to hear. So we've reached the point where the trail seems to have gone cold. We have a portrait that's described as Charlotte Brontë. We have the name of a very respectable Victorian artist, but so far we haven't found the sort of documentary evidence that we found so easily for George Richmond. Now, that naturally raises another question. If Charlotte didn't sit for Solomon, where did this image come from? Well, before we jump to any conclusions, it's worth remembering that Victorian artists didn't always need the sitter to be sat in front of them. Today, we're so used to photographs. I mean, you think about it, you can take 100 pictures on your phone in a matter of minutes, and you can capture every detail and every angle. But in the middle of the 19th century, things obviously were rather different. An artist had to work from sketches and engravings and earlier paintings, or later in the century, of course, they did have photographs. So the idea that Abraham Solomon could have painted the image of Charlotte without her actually sitting for him isn't impossible at all. In fact, it would have been entirely possible. But the real question is, what did he use? I mean, the most obvious place to begin is, of course, George Richmond's portrait, because as we've already seen, that's the only portrait we know that Charlotte definitely sat for. It was completed in June 1850, which works. And we have an excellent documentary trail to support this history. Could Solomon have seen Richmond's portrait and used it as the basis for his own? The honest answer is we simply don't know. I mean, I found suggestions that this may have happened because it's been included in a modern auction catalogue describing that very portrait. However, I haven't been able to find any contemporary evidence proving that Solomon ever saw Richmond's portrait or that he used it for the basis of his painting. So although it's an interesting possibility, I don't think we can present it as established fact. Because when you compare the two portraits, there are certainly similarities, particularly in the broad shape of Charlotte's face and of course that distinctive high forehead. At the same time, there are very obvious differences. I mean, the clothing, completely different. The pose is different as well. And of course, this portrait presents Charlotte in this very sort of romantic fairy tale way. Instead of just simply sitting for a portrait, she's shown as an author. The paper spread across the table, the quill resting in her hand, the thoughtful pose, even the flowers woven into her hair, which I don't think is very Charlotte. All of these details seem carefully chosen to create an image of Charlotte Brontë, the celebrated writer, rather than simply the woman herself. Now, of course, that's my observations when I look at this painting. I haven't found a letter or an exhibit catalogue where Abraham Solomon explains his artistic choices. So once again, we have to be careful to separate observation from evidence. But I do find it interesting that the portrait appears to tell us as much about the idea of Charlotte Brontë as it does about her actual appearance. Of course, there are other possibilities too. Perhaps Solomon worked from another sketch that hasn't survived. Or perhaps he saw Charlotte somewhere in London and made his own study with sketches and doodles and observations. Perhaps there was another portrait that has since been lost. Or perhaps the answer is something none of us have even thought of yet. At the moment, we simply don't know. And although that might sound really frustrating, I actually think it's one of the things I enjoy the most about researching Brontë history, because every now and then you come across a question that doesn't have this neat little answer. And instead of closing the book and moving on, it encourages you to keep digging, because the next piece of evidence might be just around the corner. But there's still another piece of the puzzle that I'd like to investigate. Even if Charlotte never sat for Abraham Solomon, did she ever know that this portrait existed? Because if she did, what on earth did she think of it? By this point, I found myself asking a completely different question. Let's imagine, just for a moment, that Abraham Solomon did actually paint a portrait of Charlotte. Whether Charlotte sat for it or not, surely she must have known of its existence. After all, if somebody painted your portrait, you'd expect to see it at some stage, wouldn't you? Be told about it, gossiped about. You might approve of it, you might dislike it, or you might think it made your nose look too big. But you probably have an opinion. So naturally, I went looking for Charlotte's opinion. Because, Charlotte is this well-known letter writer. She's done thousands of letters that have survived, and obviously some that haven't. But a lot have been preserved, and they give us an extraordinary insight into everyday life. I mean, she wrote about her family, her publishers, friends, travelling to London, meeting well-known people, her health, her writing, and all sorts of everyday events. If she did sit for Solomon, or if she'd been shown this portrait afterwards, I couldn't help wondering whether she might have mentioned it somewhere. So I started looking. So I revisited all the places that I've already mentioned. But once again, the trail appeared to come to an end. What that doesn't mean. It doesn't mean Charlotte never saw the portrait. It doesn't mean she disliked it. It doesn't even mean she never met Abraham Solomon. All it means is that based on the evidence we have today, we can't demonstrate any of those things with confidence. And that's quite an important distinction, because when we're researching history, there's always a temptation to just fill in those gaps. I mean, if something sounds likely, we naturally want to believe it's probably happened. Yet, when it comes to Solomon, everything seems to go remarkably quiet. Now, that silence doesn't solve the mystery. If anything, it makes me want to investigate the painting itself even more. Because perhaps the answers aren't hidden in Charlotte's letters at all. Perhaps they're hidden in the history of the portrait itself. At this stage, I decided to stop looking for Charlotte Brontë and start looking for the painting itself. After all, if the documentary trail had gone quiet around Charlotte, perhaps the painting could tell us its own story. One of the most useful things historians and art historians look for is something called provenance. It's simply the history of a painting's ownership, where it's been, who's owned it, where does it first appear in the historical records. Can we trace it all the way back to the artist? The stronger that chain of evidence is, the more confidence we can usually have in the painting's history. So I started asking those exact questions. And this is where things became interesting yet again. The earliest documented provenance that I've been able to find doesn't take us back to Howarth or to George Smith or even to Abraham himself. Instead, it takes us to the 1930s. According to the paperwork accompanying the painting when it was sold at auction, receipts survive showing it was owned by, I'm sorry, I'm not good at names, Mrs. Helen Rivas of New York in 1934 before passing through Thomas W. Best Rare Books in Boston. Much later in 1991, it was purchased from Apple and Carpenter Fine Art before eventually passing through the Salomon family. That's the earliest documented trail I've been able to uncover so far. Now that's certainly interesting, but it still leaves us with a very large gap. If the painting really was completed by 1850, what happened during that previous 84 years? Who owned it? Where was it displayed? Was it ever exhibited? How was it identified as Charlotte Brontë? At the moment, I simply don't know the answers to those questions. And that doesn't mean the painting isn't genuine. Plenty of Victorian paintings obviously have incomplete histories because they've been in private collections. But from a researcher's point of view, those missing years are incredibly important because that's exactly the period we'd most like to understand. Something else also caught my attention. Whilst researching Charlotte's portrait, I spent quite a bit of time looking through the National Portrait Gallery's records because they discuss the accepted portraits of Charlotte in considerable detail. And they even described several paintings that were once believed to depict her, but were later shown to be somebody else. What surprised me was that I couldn't find any reference to Solomon's portrait. Now, I want to be very clear and careful here. It doesn't prove that the portrait isn't genuine. Museums can't catalogue every painting in a private ownership. But I find it interesting that a portrait often described as Charlotte Brontë doesn't even appear to feature in those discussions. I mean, that simply raises another question. Is this a portrait that has quietly sat in a private collection for most of its life, largely unnoticed? Or is there another part of its story that we simply haven't uncovered yet? Either way, I don't think we've reached the end of this investigation. In fact, I think we're only just beginning. Well, after all of that research, where does it leave us? Well, when I first came across this portrait, I honestly thought I was going to make a very straightforward video about the likeness of Charlotte Brontë. I'd imagine I'd spend a bit of time finding out about Abraham Solomon, discovering when Charlotte sat for him, perhaps maybe uncovering a few little comments about the finished portrait, and that would be that. Instead, almost every answer seemed to lead to yet another question. What have we actually learned? Well, we know, of course, that George Richmond did paint Charlotte from life in June 1815 because we have all that overwhelming evidence. We've discussed it. Charlotte wrote about it. Patrick wrote about it. There's no debate about that painting. We can follow that portrait from beginning to end with remarkable degree of confidence. We also know that Abraham Solomon was a respected Victorian artist with an excellent reputation, and that this painting has, for many years, been identified as a portrait of Charlotte Brontë by him. But once we begin asking how that identification came about, the documentary trail becomes much harder to follow. As I've said, despite searching through letters and biographies and books and catalogues and you name it, I haven't found evidence that Charlotte sat for Abraham, nor have I found any surviving references to her commenting on this particular portrait. I mean, that doesn't prove those things never happened, but it does mean that at least for now, they remain unproven. We've also seen that the documented history of the painting itself doesn't currently take us all the way back to 1850. I mean, the earliest provenance I've been able to trace begins in the 20th century, leaving many decades of the painting's history still unexplained. Does that mean the portrait's not genuine? No. Does it prove it is? No. What it tells me is that there are still questions waiting to be answered. And perhaps that's what I'm enjoying most about making this video. I think it's so very easy, particularly on the internet, for something to be repeated often enough that it simply becomes fact. One website copies another website that copies another one, AI gets involved, and before long, nobody actually remembers where the information came from in the first place. And that's one of the reasons I enjoy researching the Brontes so much. I love going back to the original letters, to the original books, and to those contemporary records, because every now and again you discover that story is rather more complicated than it first appeared. This portrait is a perfect example. I hadn't set out to prove that it's wrong, and I certainly hadn't set out to discredit Abraham Solomon. If anything, I've come away even more fascinated by the painting than I was when I started. Not because all the questions have been answered, but because so many of them haven't. Perhaps somewhere there's an old exhibition catalogue waiting to be rediscovered. Perhaps there is a letter sitting quietly in an archive or in a box in the loft. Perhaps somebody watching this video knows something that I haven't been able to find. Because history has a wonderful habit of surprising us when we least expect it. So for now, I think the most honest conclusion I can reach is this. The portrait remains a fascinating image that raises some equally fascinating questions. And until more evidence comes to light, those questions deserve to remain exactly that. Questions. Or perhaps by George Richmond's famous... I'm just going to start from the beginning. Sorry, editing Kate, you're going to get with me. But as you can see, I was brave last night and actually put some pictures on the wall. And yeah, I was very proud of myself. This independent living is great. I'm loving it so far. I'm still on the comedy mugs, and I've actually just realised I have the very same mug with the pig and the tea towel as last time. So that was just a coincidence. So life in my new home. Thank you everybody, by the way, for all your kind wishes and just lovely comments last week or week before last when I just moved in. It was so lovely of you all to say, and do you know, I think the best word to describe my new home is I'm content. Loving it. It helps we have beautiful weather, but I'm so happy here. So thank you everybody for your lovely kind wishes. It really did mean a lot to me. And I've discovered I am reading so much more now. Now that I'm relaxed and happy in my new home and I don't have to worry so much, I'm reading tons. So I'm really, really pleased about that. And of course now I found half of my Brontë books. So if you're wondering what I'm talking about, I did a video 2 weeks ago about moving into my new house and discovering all my books again. And it was a lovely experience going through the boxes and trying to work out which ones to talk about. So if you're interested in what books I did talk about in that video, I'll put a link in the description, and I'll probably put one up here somewhere for you to do that clicky thing. So before I finish, there's one other thing I'd like just to mention, because I have a feeling this video might prompt a few questions. Whenever I look into anything to do with images or portraits or whatever, somebody always asks me whether I'm going to do a video about the famous Brontë photograph. You know the one I mean. It's been discussed for years now, and it's kind of divided Brontë enthusiasts into those who believe it really does show the sisters and those who are convinced it doesn't. And every time it resurfaces, the debate begins all over again. The truth is, I'm just as fascinated by that photograph as everyone else. Will I make a video about it one day? Probably yes. But if I do, I want to approach it in exactly the same way that I've approached this particular portrait. I want to go back to the original evidence, read as much as I possibly can, and look at the argument on both sides, and then reach my own conclusion based on the evidence that I have found, rather than simply sort of repeating what everybody else has said over the last few years. And the reason I haven't tackled it yet, because there are only so many hours in the day, and there are still so many Brontë stories that deserve to be explored. Some have never really been covered on YouTube at all, and while others have only really been touched on briefly. And I find those hidden stories incredibly exciting. So I'm certainly not saying never, I'm simply saying not yet. Perhaps one day I'll disappear down that particular rabbit hole with a large pot of tea and a stack of books and several weeks set aside for the research. Perhaps new evidence will come to light that makes it that right time to revisit the debate. When that day comes, I'll let the evidence lead me wherever it leads. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that I've taken away from making this video today. Because when we look at history, it's so very tempting to want every mystery just neatly wrapped up like a TV drama with a clear answer. But history doesn't always work like that. Sometimes the evidence survives and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we can say with confidence that something actually happened, and sometimes the most honest answer is simply, we don't know yet. For me, that's not frustrating at all. In fact, I think it's one of the reasons I love researching the Brontë so much. There is always another letter to read, or another archive to search, and another overlooked detail that might just change the way we understand a familiar story. So whether this portrait really is Charlotte Brontë painted by Abraham Solomon, or whether one day new evidence points us in a completely different direction, it's been such a fascinating mystery to investigate, and I hope you enjoyed coming along with me today, because whoa, it's been one hell of a journey. As always, I'd love to hear what you think, so let me ask you my 3 famous questions. Number 1, do you think this portrait really is Charlotte Brontë, or do you think the evidence leaves us with too many unanswered questions? Number 2, if you were researching this mystery, where would you look next? Is there an archive collection or a source that you think might hold another piece of this puzzle? And finally, question number 3. Are there any other Brontë mysteries that you would like me to investigate in a future video? I would genuinely love to hear your suggestions because, as you can probably tell, I do enjoy disappearing down a good Brontë rabbit hole every now and then. So please pop your answers in the comments below. I really do enjoy reading your thoughts and your ideas, and quite often your comments do send me off in a completely new direction. So thank you very much. You never know, one of you might even hold the clue that helps solve the Brontë mystery in a future video. You never know. So thank you so much for watching today. If you like this video, please do that whole likey, subscribey, hypey thing, because it really does help me out and it lets YouTube know that we want to watch more Brontë content. Have a good weekend, take care of yourselves, and I will see you all the Friday after next for more Brontë adventures. And I'll see you soon. Bye.